Kate, you're not wearing a bustle.
How dude. Come on, Holiday, you in or out, God damn it.
Why, Ed Bailey, you look like you're just about ready to burst.
There are movies you watch once and forget by the time the credits roll. And then there are movies that never leave you. Tombstone is one of those rare films that has managed to live in people's hearts for over 30 years, not because it was the most expensive Western ever made, or because it had the most powerful studio behind it, but because something real and human was poured into every frame. The performances feel lived in. The dialogue hits like a thunderclap, and somehow, even after all this time, when someone says, "I'm your Huckleberry," you know exactly what they mean and exactly how it should sound. But here's what most people sitting down to watch Tombstone on a Friday night have never known, and what Sam Elliott, one of the film's most enduring presences, has only recently begun to speak about. With any real candor, the movie that audiences fell in love with was never supposed to exist in the form they came to love it. What ended up on screen was the survivor of a brutal, chaotic, and deeply personal battle fought in the Arizona desert, in editing rooms, and in quiet conversations between actors who refused to let the story be buried. Sam Elliott has spent decades carrying the weight of what that experience truly was, and only now, with enough distance between himself and those days, has he begun to let the truth breathe. To understand what Elliott is finally saying, you have to go back to the very beginning, to the man who created the world of Tombstone before the cameras ever rolled. Kevin Jarre was not a typical Hollywood figure in any conventional sense. He was a writer, consumed by history, someone who had spent years studying the real events surrounding Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and the town of Tombstone, Arizona. When he pitched his vision for the film, it was staggeringly ambitious. He did not want a crowd-pleasing cowboy picture with clean villains and tidy heroism. He wanted something that felt like you had stepped into 1881 and were watching real people navigate an impossible world. His script reflected that obsession. It ran to well over 200 pages, nearly double the length of a standard Hollywood screenplay. Every character, from the central figures like Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday down to the smallest saloon worker, had a fully realized interior life. The cowboys, who served as the story's villains, were not cartoons. They were desperate, forgotten men trying to survive on the margins of a changing country. Stars like Kurt Russell and Sam Elliott signed on because of that vision. They read that script and saw something rare. Elliott, in particular, was drawn to the depth given to Virgil Earp, his character, a man pulled between his duty as a lawman and his desperate love for his family and his longing for a quieter life. Those were not themes you typically found in westerns of that era. This was a film with something real to say, and Elliott knew it. What followed was one of the most troubled productions in Western film history. Jarre, who was directing for the first time, quickly ran into the brutal reality that passion and vision do not automatically translate into the practical management of a massive Hollywood production. Filming in the Arizona desert presented enormous physical challenges: heat, dust, exhaustion, and the sheer logistical weight of coordinating hundreds of crew members and actors across long and punishing shooting days created an atmosphere of mounting frustration. And Jarre, whose perfectionism was both his greatest strength and his fatal flaw, struggled to keep the production on pace. Hours would disappear as he worked and reworked details that, to the studio watching the budget climb, seemed to serve no visible purpose. What the studio saw was a production burning through money with no clear end in sight. What the cast saw was a director fighting for every inch of the story he had spent years building. The two realities could not coexist for long. Jarre was removed from the production, an event that hit the cast with the force of a physical blow. Elliott has said in recent years that the day Jarre was let go, something that had been alive on that set went quiet. The crew had believed in what they were building together. Suddenly they were standing in the desert with a half-finished film and no clear direction. The studio brought in George Cosmatos to take over. Cosmatos was an experienced director with a track record of delivering big films under pressure, and on paper his arrival seemed to stabilize the situation. For a while, that is exactly what it appeared to do. The The set calmed. The shoot moved forward, and from the outside, it looked like a functioning Hollywood production had finally been restored. But Sam Elliott and the other cast members knew the real story, and it is this truth that Elliott has only now been willing to name clearly. Kurt Russell, who was already carrying the weight of playing Wyatt Earp, the emotional and moral center of the entire film, was simultaneously functioning as the real creative engine behind the scenes. Every night after shooting, when other actors were resting their bodies from the physical demands of the day, Russell was reviewing footage, rewriting scenes, sketching out camera angles, and building the roadmap that Cosmatos would carry on to the set the following morning. Elliott has reflected on this with a mixture of awe and gratitude. Russell was not doing this for credit or recognition. He never sought the director's title or the additional compensation that might have come with it. He did it because he understood that if someone did not step into the gap that Jar's departure had left, the film would collapse entirely, and he understood that this story was worth saving. The legal realities of Hollywood at that time were unambiguous. Union rules governed who could officially direct a production, and an actor secretly running the show behind a credited director would have created enormous legal exposure for everyone involved. So the arrangement stayed quiet. Cosmatos stood at the front of the set. Russell worked from the shadows. What Elliott finds most striking, looking back now, is not the secrecy itself, but the quality of what Russell produced under those conditions. The shot selections, the pacing decisions, the way individual scenes were sculpted to let performances breathe, all of it reflected a genuine cinematic intelligence. Russell had opinions about how the story should feel, about where the camera should sit and when it should move, about which lines deserved silence around them and which moments needed to be pushed. And those opinions turned out to be correct, because the film that emerged from that chaotic process is one of the most rewatchable westerns ever committed to celluloid. But there was another battle being fought during production, one that went largely unnoticed at the time and that Elliott has become increasingly vocal about as the years have passed. It was the battle to protect Val Kilmer's portrayal of Doc Holliday. When people think about Tombstone today, they often think of Kilmer first. His Doc Holliday is one of those performances that seems to exist outside the normal boundaries of acting. He is not playing a character. He is channeling something older and stranger and more dangerous than any character. The wit is razor-sharp and the delivery is impeccable, but what makes the performance truly unforgettable is the physical reality underneath it. Kilmer made choices to embody Holliday's tuberculosis that went far beyond what any director asked of him. He lay on ice between takes to induce the physical tremors that appear in his scenes. He worked on his quick draw until his hands were raw. He built a voice and a posture and a rhythm of speech that felt like they had been assembled from the actual historical record rather than from any acting textbook. And the studio hated it. Not universally, and not immediately, but the concern grew as they reviewed footage. What they were seeing did not match their template for a Western hero or even a Western supporting character. Holliday in Kilmer's hands was too pale, too fragile, too unpredictable, too electric. Executives pushed for adjustments. They wanted something more familiar, something audiences would recognize as fitting the genre. They floated the idea of reshooting his scenes. There were conversations, according to Elliott, about reducing Holliday's screen time so that the character would not dominate to the degree Kilmer's performance threatened to. Russell and Elliott pushed back. They understood what Kilmer was doing in a way the studio could not, because they were in those scenes with him. They felt the energy he brought to every exchange. Elliott's Virgil Earp was a steadying presence in the narrative, a man of duty trying to hold a fractured family together. Kilmer's Holliday was the wild variable, the character who could be charming and lethal in the same breath, who seemed to exist on a different frequency from everyone else on screen. That contrast was not accidental. It was essential to the story's heartbeat. The decision to keep Holliday's scenes largely intact was ultimately shaped by economics rather than artistic courage. Reshooting would have cost money and time that the production did not have. And so, almost by accident, one of the greatest performances in American cinema survived. What audiences never knew was how close it came to being cut. There was another force working against Tombstone that deserves to be named plainly, because it shaped the experience of making the film in ways that extended far beyond the Arizona set. Kevin Costner was, at that point in the early 1990s, one of the most powerful figures in Hollywood. He had followed the enormous success of Dances with Wolves with continued box office dominance, and he was developing his own Wyatt Earp film, simply titled Wyatt Earp, which was backed by a major studio with a substantial budget and every institutional advantage one could imagine. The Tombstone crew began to notice that essential resources were becoming strangely unavailable. Period costumes, authentic hats, the particular style of long coats and boots that were necessary to make the Old West feel real on screen, all of it was being locked up. Horse wranglers and prop suppliers who would normally have been available were suddenly committed elsewhere, or were receiving quiet signals that their continued involvement with prestige projects depended on their cooperation. The message, according to people who worked on the film, was clear, even when it was never stated directly. Tombstone was being squeezed. The production responded with a resourcefulness that, in retrospect, seems almost poetic. They looked overseas. London and Paris became unlikely partners in the effort to dress Wyatt Earp and his brothers in convincing period clothing, and what they discovered was that the European costume houses, working from historical sources, had access to fabrics and designs that were arguably more authentic than anything available domestically. The costumes in the finished film have a texture and a weight to them that contribute enormously to the sense of period reality that Jar had always wanted. What began as an act of desperation became one of the film's defining visual qualities. Elliott has spoken about this period as one of unexpected solidarity. The cast and crew knew they were the underdogs. They understood that the industry's attention and resources were tilted toward the competing film, and rather than breed resentment or resignation, that understanding created a kind of unity. Nobody was working on Tombstone because it was the safe bet. They were working on it because they believed in the story. But even with all of those challenges met and overcome, even with Russell holding the creative vision together in the shadows and Kilmer delivering something extraordinary every day, and the European costumes lending the film a grounded authenticity, there remained a wound that Sam Elliott has never fully stopped feeling. It is the wound of what was lost. Kevin Jar's original screenplay, the one that had drawn these actors to the project in the first place, was a different kind of film. It was longer, more complex, and more emotionally demanding. The Earp wives, who appear only briefly in the finished film, were originally central figures with fully developed arcs. Elliott's Virgil Earp had scenes with his wife Allie that explored the human cost of the life they were living, her fear, her loneliness, her unwillingness to accept the violence that seemed to follow the Earp name everywhere they went. Those scenes explain Virgil in a way the finished film only gestures toward. They made him a man haunted by love as much as by duty. The cowboys, too, had been given a dimension that the finished film largely strips away. Jar's script explored the internal relationships among the men in red sashes, particularly the bond between Ike Clanton and Curly Bill, with a sympathy that refused to reduce them to simple antagonists. They were men who had been left behind by the country's eastward-facing progress, men for whom the frontier was not a romantic adventure, but a last resort. Removing those sequences made Tombstone faster and more commercially viable. It also made it smaller. The aftermath of the gunfight at the OK Corral was another casualty of the cuts. History records that the Earps were not immediately celebrated after that confrontation. They were arrested. They stood trial. The town that had seemed to want their protection turned on them in ways that were ugly and complicated and deeply revealing about the nature of frontier justice. Jar had written those courtroom scenes. Russell and Elliott had filmed them. The footage existed, but the studio, already nervous about competing with a bigger film and eager to keep Tombstone moving at the pace of an action picture, demanded that the storytelling shift toward more gunfights and fewer words. Elliott does not speak about this with bitterness. He is too seasoned for that and too honest about the nature of the film industry. Compromise is not a failure of integrity in Hollywood. It is the condition under which almost everything is made. But he does speak about it with a persistent ache. The ache of someone who knows what might have been, and who carries the ghost of that version alongside the film that actually exists. What he wants people to understand, now that he is finally willing to say it plainly, is that the Tombstone they love required an almost inhuman level of commitment from people who received very little official recognition for what they gave. Russell directed a major film without a director's credit and without a director's salary. The cast protected performances that the studio wanted, softened and pushed back against decisions that would have flattened the story. European artisans contributed to the film's visual identity under circumstances they probably never fully understood, and Kevin Jarre, the man who built the world in which all of this took place, watched from outside the fence as the production he had poured himself into moved forward without him. The question that Elliott finds himself sitting with, and that he now poses to anyone who will listen, is this: what does it mean that such a beloved film was born from so much chaos and loss and struggle? Is there something in the film's imperfection, its roughness, its sense of something real and unfinished just beneath the surface, that actually accounts for why it endures when so many more polished productions from the same era have been forgotten? He thinks there might be. He thinks that audiences, without being able to articulate it, can feel the difference between a film that was manufactured and a film that was survived. Tombstone has the quality of survival. You can see it in the way the performances sometimes push against the edges of what the story can contain. You can feel it in the moments where the writing does something unexpected, where a line of dialogue or a look between characters carries more weight than the scene around it seems able to support. Those are the moments where Kevin Jarre's original vision managed to get through the cracks. 30 years is a long time to carry a story. Sam Elliott has spent those decades watching Tombstone become something that he himself did not fully predict. A film that gets quoted at dinner tables and passed from parents to children and revisited at moments when people need something that feels honest and true. He is proud of that. He is proud of the performances, proud of the commitment that everyone on that set brought to a production that the industry largely expected to fail, and proud of the version of the story that survived. But he is also honest about the version that did not, the 3-hour epic that Kevin Jarre imagined, the one with the wives at its center, and the cowboys rendered as human beings, and the Earps standing in a courtroom answering for what they had done. That film lives only in memory now, in the testimony of the people who were there, and in the pages of a script that was cut apart and partially burned in the desperate rush to finish a movie that everyone feared was already dead. What Sam Elliott wants fans to finally understand after all these years is that the Tombstone they love is not the film that was planned. It is the film that was rescued, and the people who rescued it did so out of love, out of stubbornness, out of the kind of refusal to quit that the real Wyatt Earp himself would probably have recognized. The film survived because the people making it decided it was worth saving, even when the industry had already begun writing its obituary. That, Elliott suggests, is the secret that was hiding in plain sight all along. Not any single revelation or scandal, but a simple and almost unbearable truth. Great films are sometimes not made. They are survived. And sometimes, the scars of that survival are exactly what make them great.